first things that we can talk about, which seems to be the particularly relevant piece of information within recent history, in particular with regard to national surveillance, is a discussion about Edward Snowden. So if I say Edward Snowden, how many of you all know who I'm talking about? Okay, good, everyone. Did you see the John Oliver segment where he was polling people on who Edward Snowden was and they all thought he was the WikiLeaks guy? And then he showed that interview to Ed Snowden in Russia and he got really disappointed. So Snowden, as you all know, I won't give you the full background, worked for the NSA and leaked a bunch of information about various activities that were going on within the NSA. And so if we look at what has come out so far, so he's given the information to other sources at this point who are supposed to disseminate the information at various times. But from what has been released so far, there are some things that we know. The first is that the US government has been engaging in mass collection of phone records, and telecommunication companies were largely compliant. Two, the second thing we know is about an NSA program titled Program PRISM. And under this program, the US government could request data from at least 9 different major tech companies. And under law, these companies were required to comply with these requests. Third, we know that the NSA directly tapped into data centers of major tech companies without their prior knowledge. So in the event, so notice what's going on here. So in the first two bullet points, we have the government engaging in massive data collection. The companies are largely compliant. In the second one, they're required to comply, even if they don't want to. And then in the third one, we have like a backdoor option in case for whatever reason we don't get the information that we want from number 1 or number 2. But there are other things too. From the Snowden leaks, we know that rule changes in 2011 allowed the NSA to search telephone and email communications of US citizens without a warrant. We also know that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or the FISC court, weakened the constraints of government agencies, allowing them to share unfiltered information between different agencies on US citizens. So I spoke to you all yesterday about those joint terrorism task forces, talking about how information was flowing from federal organizations like the FBI, the CIA, to domestic organizations like state and local police departments. So here we see something similar, but on a different level. We have organizations like the NSA who's sharing very sensitive personal information with other arms of the government. We know that the NSA actively undermined internet security. So one of the things that you frequently hear about, how many of you all have had to have some kind of IT training at some point, like security stuff for your university or your employer? Well, all of those, they like caution you about things, telling you to, avoid like opening email attachments from like people you don't know, talking about encryption or trying to prevent hackers from accessing your information. And this is something that's talked about fairly frequently, especially when it comes to sensitive data. Well, we know that the NSA actively undermined internet security and they actually required tech companies to install these backdoor programs that would allow them to have larger access to the data. It would allow the US government to circumvent various encryption measures intended to keep people's personal information safe. Now, the problem with this should be readily apparent, because if you're trying to make your data particularly safe and you install something that is supposed to allow people to circumvent these safety measures, then what does that lead to? Yeah, it's unsafe. It's a backdoor. People can get your information. And lastly, we know that the NSA actively spied on over 120 world leaders, including US allies. So people like Angela Merkel or the German Prime Minister, Chancellor, right word for that. Understandably so, when your allies find out that you're spying on them, this doesn't make them particularly happy. So this is kind of the lay of the land for domestic surveillance. Well, but why? Why do we have these surveillance policies in place? Terrorists, duh. Like, that's the blanket answer. We have these policies because we're supposed to be fighting this global war on terror. And now terrorism can come through the computer, cyber attacks. So these policies are supposedly implemented not only for those kinds of attacks, but to figure out, like, well, people are going to be sending these like electronic communications like over the internet. If we can intercept these, then we can figure out who is doing what. We can work to prevent attacks before they happen. So this is the idea behind a lot of these national surveillance policies. In particular, some of the more nefarious pieces of this, so like the bulk collection of data, that was authorized by Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which was passed very hastily after 9/11 to allow counterterrorism measures to progress more quickly without much oversight. With all of these things going on, so like national surveillance, hot topic, other kinds of counterterrorism policies are things that we hear about all the time. So for a lot of you especially, you've probably grown up most of your life hearing consistently about war on terror, war on terror, war on terror. Well, you hear about it so much, you're probably inclined to think that terrorism is something that happens fairly frequently. And the only reason that it's not is because the government is involved and trying to protect and keep us safe. But in fact, terrorism actually isn't that common. And being killed in a terrorist attack is really uncommon. So here I have a quote from Daniel Benjamin. He's the former coordinator for counterterrorism for the US State Department. So in theory, this should be a guy who knows what he's talking about in regard to terrorism. And he says, the total number of deaths from terrorism in recent years has been extremely small in the West. Given all the headlines, people don't have that perception, but if you look at the statistics, this is the case. So just how unlikely is it that you are going to die in a terror attack? Well, a quick search of Google, and I wanted to find things that would be more likely to kill you than a terror attack. So if nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this lecture, then remember that you're more likely to die from so many other things than a terror attack. So things more likely to kill you. Driving. This one's probably not surprising. You spend a lot of time in the car. Lots of other people spend time in the car. Everybody thinks that they can drive and other people can't. There's some combination going on there. Driving. Swimming. It's another way that's more likely to kill you. Lightning. More likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed by a terrorist. This is important for me because I'm moving to Tampa. It's apparently the lightning strike capital of the world. So I told my fiance, no golf, ever. The flu. People tend to forget that these kinds of diseases can be fatal, especially in people who are immunocompromised, more likely to die from the flu. Alcoholism. So if you are one of those people who likes the sauce and you pickle yourself, that's a lot more likely to kill you than a terrorist attack. STDs, obesity, and heart disease. And in fact, you are 35,079 times more likely to die from heart disease than from a terror attack. Cancer. Cancer is another one. You're almost 34,000 times more likely to die from cancer than from a terror attack. So this toddler is probably more likely to kill you than a terrorist is. Dying in a fire. So for those of you who played that computer game, The Sims, you're more likely to die like one of your Sims than you are to die in a terrorist attack. And for those of you who laughed, thank you. Drowning in a bathtub. Deer incidents. They did not elaborate on what deer incident meant. So I'm assuming it's probably something like you're driving, Bambi hops out in front of your car, and Bambi doesn't have a good day either, granted. I'm assuming it's stuff like that, but I'd also like to think that there's something a lot more fun to deer incidents going on. Food poisoning, brain-eating parasites. This was one I found particularly fun. Police officers, so there's that statistic. You're 9 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than you are to die in a terror attack. 9 times. Falling out of bed. I don't know about you all, but those beds in the dorm room are really high. It's like pole vaulting to get on those things. So falling out of bed, all of these are things that are more likely to kill you than a terror attack. A couple of other factoids just to kind of clear up some standard misconceptions that people have about terrorism. non-Muslims have carried out the vast majority of terror attacks in the West. Does anybody know what the like the number one motive is behind terrorism in the U.S. historically? Anybody? It's eco-terrorism. The vast majority of attacks in the U.S. are not conducted by Muslims, but it's done by people who are angry about various environmental causes. But if you look at the statistics regarding casualties for attacks that are carried out by Muslim extremist groups, the vast majority of those who are injured or killed are not, in fact, Westerners, but they're, in fact, other Muslims. Yeah?
Real quick, could you clarify with the last one? Is that within the U.S. still, or?
All terror attacks. So terror attacks that are carried out tend to result in more fatalities and injuries to Muslims.
For the first statistic, do you have anything on the whole world? Or is that hard to find?
So I haven't looked at the, this one is directly specific to the US and Europe. I don't know off the top of my head about international terrorist attacks. My guess is that that's probably going to be skewed because every time something happens in Afghanistan or Iraq, then that would be counted in that. So my guess is that data is probably going to be skewed. I could be wrong though, but I can look that up. Good questions. Terror groups tend to attack a variety of targets. So tends not to just be buildings or public transit. They tend to try to do a lot of different things for reasons that hopefully will become clear in a few minutes. And most terrorist attacks against the US, I know I have that in quotation marks, against the US actually don't occur on US soil. Instead, they are occurring abroad. They refer to this as transnational terrorism. So if a US embassy, for example, so like Benghazi, if a US embassy is attacked by a particular group, or if a international group is attacked abroad and there are Americans in that group, that's considered an attack against US citizens, even though it doesn't actually occur in the US. And this includes things like kidnapping US reporters, bombing embassies, things like that. And the other thing too is most terrorists actually don't utilize suicide tactics. There's something we can talk about more in Q&A if you want. There's an interesting book, and I could kick myself because the author's name is escaping me, but he analyzes actually terrorists who do utilize suicide tactics. And what he finds is that terrorists tend to shift toward using suicide tactics when their country is being occupied, which is something that we can talk about more and the reasons of why that might be the case. So what's been the government response to all of this? So we know that, and we saw from the beginning kind of what some of this response has been. We know that not a lot of people are dying in terrorist attacks, at least not in the West. The number of terrorist deaths have been very small. The fatalities, the injuries as well, have also been very small. And yet there's been a very massive response to terrorism in the US post 9/11. And so what kinds of things do we see that are implemented? Surveillance, so all of those things from the first couple of slides about the NSA that I was talking about, all of those things have come about as a result of terrorism policy. Everyone's favorite organization, the TSA, that also came about as a result of terrorism policy or counterterrorism policy. That was done under the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which was the largest restructuring of the US government in history. It brought some like 20-something different organizations under this larger umbrella with the purpose of combating terrorism. And of course, we all know what the TSA does. You go, now you have to like kick off your shoes, like you run everything through the scanner, like they pat you down. We were talking at lunch, if you all ever want to look at anything interesting, TSA has an Instagram account. And oh boy, is it fun, because they'll have, you all hear about the recent story where the TSA, they failed their own test from the Department of Homeland Security and like 95% of the stuff that they were supposed to catch, they didn't catch. Well, they have a hashtag, the TSA, and it's called TSA Good Catch. And it should be like hashtag couldn't have missed it if I tried. because it's stuff like a machete, of like, this machete was, somebody tried to bring this machete into Fort Lauderdale's airport. And my reaction is, not surprised it was in Fort Lauderdale. Not surprised at all. But the second reaction is like, you could, like, I mean, unless you were quite literally blind, like you couldn't have missed it. But I can rant about the TSA during Q&A if you want. And there are a variety of other programs too, and I bet if I asked you all could probably name more security programs than I could, because there are a ton of them. So with this in mind, this is what I want us to think about. I want us to remember that when we're talking about the economic way of thinking, it's a framework for viewing the world around us. It is a way for us to look out into the world and try to make sense of what it is that we see. So how is it that we can use economics, not just to understand terrorism policy, but to actually understand terrorists themselves? So if you're a terrorist, why is it that you make the decisions that we do? And more importantly, once we figure out how it is that terrorists go about making these decisions, what does this tell us, or does this tell us something important about whether or not these kinds of policies that we've been talking about, what does that tell us about whether or not these policies have historically been effective or are likely going to be effective in the future? So the economic way of thinking applies to everybody. You all, me, your mom, Mother Teresa. What do? We all make decisions based on cost and benefits, right? We talked about this a little bit this morning. We all make decisions based upon cost and benefits. We respond to the incentives that we face. Terrorists do the exact same thing. They face decisions about cost and benefits, and they face incentives, and they respond to those incentives. So this is our terrorist. I typed terrorist into Google, and this is one of the things that came up. He looks like he could be. He's one of those like eco-terrorists, I guess. So I don't know. He needs a name. It's a good name.
Billy Bob.
Billy Bob? All right, terrorist Billy Bob. We'll just call him Bill. All right, Bill, our terrorist. So Bill is our terrorist. And I want you guys to put yourself in the shoes of Bill. So we are going to think like Bill the terrorist. So just, you know, whatever you have to do to get yourself into character, like, you know, you need to like deep breath, something like that. Just, yeah, exactly. Whatever mantra you have for getting into character, I want you to, for the next few minutes, I want you to become Bill the terrorist. So we can assume that a terrorist derives what economists call utility, or we could say happiness. Terrorists, we could say, let's say they derive happiness from committing acts of terror. So they think that they're going to get some kind of benefit out of it, whether it's awareness to their cause, whether killing people makes them happy. They think like, well, there are this many fewer people that are going to disagree with my position. We assume that they derive some kind of personal benefit from committing acts of terror. So this can fall under a number of different things. So things like skyjacking, also known as hijacking an airplane, bombings, kidnappings, there are all different kinds of things that we can put in this list. And further, using the economic way of thinking, we can talk about when a terrorist would commit an act of terror. So I know yesterday Ben talked to you all about just the optimal decision rule of when you decide you're going to produce another unit or consume another unit, something like that. So we want to know if the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost of carrying out the terror attack, what are you going to do? If you're, remember, you're Bill. Yeah, you do it. You're like, heck yes. Marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. So from a terrorist perspective, and that's the important thing to keep in mind. That's why we're channeling our inner Bill. So marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. You're going to carry out the terror attack. If this inequality reverses itself, then what are you going to do? Are you going to carry out the attack or no? No, because the marginal benefit doesn't exceed the marginal cost. So what's important to think about in this context? The important thing to think about is what happens when we change either the marginal benefit or the marginal cost to engaging in a terrorist activity if you're Bill. So if the cost of doing something increases or the benefit of doing something increases or decreases, this is going to change, again, we're Bill, this is going to change what we see as being something that we want to undertake as a terrorist act. So the example that I use here to discuss this is usually airplane hijacking, because it's something that, especially after 9/11, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So in an airplane hijacking, what happens? You have people on a plane, people take over the cockpit. Back in the 1970s, they used to hijack airplanes, but they would be on the runway, and like people would sit there for long periods of time, and there was a standoff. Now people hijack planes. 9/11, they flew the planes into buildings. So we can talk about hijacking, and we're going to talk about hijacking, again, from Bill's perspective. So we have to make a choice about whether or not we want to engage in hijacking an airplane. So we want to ask ourselves, well, what is the benefit to hijacking an airplane, and what's the cost to hijacking an airplane? So there's a cost to engaging in this activity, and let's say something happens to increase the cost of hijacking an airplane. So you all tell me, what is the supposed purpose of the TSA?
Increase the cost.
All right, so potentially we could be saying like we want to increase the cost?
Increase the cost of hijacking.
Right, we want to increase the cost to hijacking an airplane for terrorists. So if you can't bring knives, if you can't bring sharp objects, if you can't bring, large blunt instruments onto airplanes, then exactly, we're supposed to be increasing the cost to a terrorist. So the idea is the following. Maybe Bill faces this decision where the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost for hijacking an airplane. So the idea is something like the following. After implementing TSA measures, what are we effectively trying to do? We're trying to flip that inequality sign so that Bill no longer wants to engage in that terror activity. Well, in doing so, in raising the cost of hijacking an airplane, we would expect to see a couple of different effects from this. So the first is what economists refer to as income effects. So all income effects are saying, and I know a lot of you have had economics classes, though some of you haven't, what income effects basically say is the price of something increases and you feel it in your wallet. You feel poorer because the price of this thing that you were consuming has gone up. And so as a result of the fact that you liked hijacking airplanes, it was very beneficial to you, now it's more expensive in terms of it's harder to do. It's now more expensive for you to do so. So since you feel this way, now you're going to not hijack as many airplanes. You're going to want to do something else with those resources that you would have used hijacking airplanes. The second thing that we see are what are known as substitution effects. So our income effects meant we felt poorer, so as a result, we were going to scale back the resources that we were using to hijack airplanes. Well, now we still have this increased cost for hijacking, but if we talk about the cost of hijacking relative to the cost of other things, what's happened? So we had, the marginal cost for hijacking, and now let's say we've got the things I have at the bottom: train bombings, mail attacks, cyber attacks. So we'll just put the marginal cost of bombing and the marginal cost of mail attacks. So we now increase the cost of engaging in hijacking. So what is this option going to look like? Maybe we don't have numbers with this, but we can think about it. We increase the cost of doing option A. So what is this going to do for option B and option C? Remember, we're Bill. It makes these relatively cheaper. Does that make sense? Yeah. If it doesn't, it's okay. Basically what we're saying is that now since you've increased the cost of hijacking an airplane, these two things now look relatively more appealing. Because since you've increased the cost of doing one thing, now those two things, so the bombings and the mail attacks, actually look significantly cheaper than what they might have looked like before. And so we can start maybe to try to piece together how this is going to influence our terrorism policy. So what have we seen since 9/11? Have we seen another airplane hijacking in the US? No. But what have we seen in the US post 9/11? We've had the Boston bombing. We had that anthrax scare, which was at this point like over a decade ago at this point, where they were sending anthrax to government efficiencies in the mail, or government agencies in the mail. So we're kind of starting to see some of these effects that, okay, maybe this did increase the cost of engaging in airplane hijacking, but relatively speaking, now these other methods of terrorism appear to be less costly from the perspective of a terrorist. So are my bills still with me? Good? All right. So we see this in other places as well, and people have actually been interested in this question, and they've talked about this empirically. So there's a paper by Landis, who I don't have the year up there, and I should. Landis actually looked at this idea of airplane hijacking, but he looked at it for a much earlier period. He looked at it for the 1970s. And 1970s, this is way back before the TSA. So like when my parents used to fly, they would say like you could walk with the person like all the way to the gate, and then they'd just like get on the plane. And there was no like real security or anything like that. In the 1970s, they did have a policy change in response in large part to some of these hijackings that were going on around the globe. And that is they installed metal detectors. So all of you all know what a metal detector is, what a metal detector does. And so he asked, well, has this had an impact, a measurable empirical impact on airplane hijackings? And he found that actually it did have a significant impact on airplane hijackings over the next few decades. Does anybody care to guess, though, what happened to other forms of terrorism over that same period? Yeah, they increased. One of the other things that happens, and we'll talk about this in the discussion in a little less than an hour from now, but one of the things that you also see happen from the perspective of a terrorist, so remember your bill, the cost of engaging in this is much higher. And so one of the things that you're now going to want to do, since this is relatively expensive, let's say that you do decide that you're going to hijack an airplane. What are some things that you might want to ensure are going to happen if you decide to expend the resources to hijack an airplane? Somebody mentioned it earlier. Yeah. Bingo. You're going to want a big impact. This is like the bang for your buck kind of an argument. So if you're a terrorist and you're like, this is really expensive for me to do, so I'm going to what? I'm going to go big or I'm going to go home. So if I'm going to expend the resources to carry out this terrorist attack, which is now more expensive, then I'm going to make sure that it has a really big impact. So you want lots of injuries, lots of casualties. And so if we look at the data from the period where we start seeing all these different terrorist policies enacted, we start to see this very thing happening. It's what economists and others refer to as potency effects. So things become more difficult to do, so you decide, well, if I'm going to undertake this action and it's particularly risky, then I want to make it worth my while. And so you start to see this trend where you have fewer terror attacks, but much higher casualty rates and much higher injury rates. So if you look back historically, and there are lots of data sets on this, they're really cool. If you look at historical data, there used to be a lot more terror attacks, but if you look at like the number of fatalities or the number of injuries, they were very, very small. But as you start moving closer and closer to the modern period, you start to see that there are a fewer raw number of attacks, but that the impact is much more significant. So can the government use its counterterrorism policy to stop terrorism? So you can break character. You can come out of being Bill now. Very good job. You was all very convinced. Can government counterterrorism policy stop terrorism? Well, maybe in some instances. The government reports that they've prevented a fair number of attacks. Now, in some cases they report this and then it comes out later that what they referred to as thwarting dozens of attacks, maybe a dozen actually translates to approximately one. But we could say, give it a charitable interpretation and say that maybe counterterrorism policy has in fact worked to decrease or prevent some acts of terror. But remember what we've just worked through in terms of talking about Bill the terrorist, is that just because we made it more difficult for one type of terror activity to take place doesn't mean that we've effectively eliminated terrorism. At best, we've shifted one type of terrorism onto another type of terrorism. So in the example we used, it was hijacking. So now instead of hijacking airplanes, we bomb the Boston Marathon. We send anthrax through the mail. We launch cyber attacks because now these things are all relatively cheaper. And the economics of prohibition, we'll come back to that in the next lecture. So it's kind of like, it's like a proverbial game then of whack-a-mole. If I say whack-a-mole, you all know the game I'm talking about, like you played when you were a kid. It's like one thing pops up, you smack it down, another thing pops up, you smack it down, another thing keeps popping up. And so then what kind of policy then does that lend itself to? We have to keep implementing more and more policies, right? Because now it's like if, well, they were hijacking airplanes and now they don't seem to be doing that anymore, but now they are, now they're bombing the Boston Marathon, they're using pressure cookers. And so do you all know what happened to pressure cooker sales after the bombing of the Boston Marathon? So yeah, the increase, but what happened in the stores? So I actually know this because I went to buy a pressure cooker not too long after the Boston Marathon bombings. And I went in to go find them, and now I had to go to 4 different stores before I found one that sold one, because they were under a lot of pressure to get rid of them and stop selling them because the 2 people who had bombed the Boston Marathon had used pressure cookers. And so now it's like, I just want to make like some oxtail. Like I just don't want to spend like 9 hours like waiting for this roast to cook. Like I just want it fast. And it's, so that's another example of something. So maybe now like the next time it's not pressure cookers, it's something else. And so you see this kind of like bouncing around from like thing to thing to thing to thing to try to increase the cost of engaging in all of these terrorist activities. But the list that we have over here in terms of the bombing, mail, hijacking, that's not an all-inclusive list of all the different things that we could potentially do if we're Bill the terrorist to try to wreak havoc. So what are some other impacts of policy? Well, since we're playing this game of whack-a-mole, we have to ask, and I kind of got ahead of myself a moment ago. In theory, we'd like to raise the cost of all terrorist activities, or at least if you're the government, you want to raise the cost of all terrorist activities to the point where they're high enough that terrorists don't want to engage in these activities. Like it's so costly for you to do it, then it's no longer worth it. But given how people innovate, and given the fact that if you're a terrorist and you really have an end goal in mind, the idea that you're going to be able to probably snuff out every avenue through which individuals can engage in acts of terrorism is either going to be very, very costly for you as a government enterprise and for the people who live under your regime, or it's going to be impossible. And we can also think about this in terms of obvious or like seen cost and unseen cost. So for something like this, like trying to stamp out all the forms of terrorism, we can say something, well, the cost of this terrorism policy is the following. Every year, the Department of Homeland Security spends millions of dollars in an attempt to prevent terrorism to make us safer. But there are unseen costs to this too, or secondary effects. And so these are things like I was talking about yesterday, things that happen as a result of these kinds of policies, but that maybe we don't see right away. So like the direct causal link, it's not A to B. It's A, and then you have a period of time in between and certain things, and it's related, but the causal arrow isn't as pretty. So here's an example. Going back to the example from Landis talking about metal detectors in the airport. So you have something like metal detectors. Metal detectors go into the airport. Then you have like the shoe bomber. So like fast forward. So it used to be right after 9/11, you could walk into the airport, you could go through TSA, you had to keep your shoes on. What happened? Somebody got creative, they put explosives in their shoes, and now what happens? You have to smell everybody's foot funk every time you go through line in the TSA. So you have the shoe bomber. So now you have to take off your shoes. Then what happens to the lines in security? Because you also have to take everything out of your laptop and stuff too. So now what happens? You have to get to the airport like 2 hours before your flight is supposed to leave. Well, what kind of implications does that have? Well, now instead of spending that extra hour in your office working, now you have to go to the airport so you can make sure that you get through TSA so that you can get to your flight in time. Well, that may seem trivial, but that means that you're now less productive as a person because of this policy. And so if you add this up for all of the people who are traveling, this effect can, in fact, be significant. And it's not a trivial cost. So counterterrorism policy may decrease the likelihood of some things, but it's highly improbable, perhaps impossible, that we're going to get rid of all forms of terrorism. And from this, we can start to ask ourselves some important questions about terrorism policy. Because I'll be the first person to say, I don't like terrorism. Terrorism's awful. People get injured, people get killed. It's an absolutely terrible thing. But one of the things that economics requires us to do is it requires us to ask, just because we don't like something or we wish something wasn't true, so I wish that terrorism didn't exist. I wish that we could get rid of terrorism. But just because we want something or we think that something should be a particular way doesn't mean that it can be that way. It doesn't mean that it's feasible. And so in talking about these policies, we see that maybe stamping out some forms of terrorism is feasible, but there are significant costs to engaging in these policies. So then we can start asking questions like, is this new form of terrorism? So Boston bombing, anthrax mail, high casualty rate terror attacks, so maybe they happen less frequently, but they have much higher of an impact. Is that scenario preferable to something like we experienced in like the 1970s, where we had more instances of terror attacks, but the fatality and the injury rates were significantly lower? And that's not a yes or no kind of a question. That's an open-ended question of, is this preferable to this other thing? And again, what are the costs associated with these things in terms of the monetary cost and also in human lives, civil liberties? So maybe, so let me put a thought experiment to you all this way. Let's say that there is a way that we can completely eliminate all terrorist activities, but it is going to require you to give up all of your like first 10 Amendment. It's going to require you to give up all of those rights. Is that an acceptable cost to have zero terrorism? I'm asking, is that an acceptable cost to you?
No, of course not. That wouldn't make any sense, especially your airport example. Mm-hmm. All that stuff that we go through.
Yes.
And you told us earlier that eco-terrorism is that's where most of the U.S. terrorism is?
Most of it's
eco-terrorism.
insane. Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, throwing away all your freedoms, that's basically, like, defeating the point of getting rid of terrorism, because terrorism, you want the right to live and everything. You want all your freedoms. But the fact that you're giving away your freedoms is really like counterintuitive.
Very good point. So one of the things, and I mentioned liberties to this crowd because I know it's important to you, but for some people, they're like, especially if you look at the polls after 9/11, for example, it was like over 50% of Americans, it was like 63%, I think, said that they thought they would have to give up some civil liberties in order to be safe. And most of them felt perfectly fine with that. But for other people, it's like monetary cost. So the point I was trying to make is that you could come up maybe with a scenario in which you can drive whatever this thing is that you don't like, that you can get that completely down to zero. But the cost to doing that may be so high you would never in a million years undertake that policy. So in that case, what you're essentially admitting to yourself is, yes, I hate terrorism, but I recognize that the optimal number of terror attacks is not zero. And if you say that to a lot of people in polite company, they're going to look at you like you're weird. They're going to look at you like you're a terrible person. I'm like, what do you mean? You want terrorism? It's like, no. Like, I don't want terrorism. I just recognize that in undertaking any kind of policy action, that there is a cost to engaging in these things. So this brings us back to really where we were at the beginning. So as a result of all of these things, and now it's this surveillance thing that is really the hot button, hot topic issue, especially with stuff with the Patriot Act, which I'll talk about on the next slide. You have the US that's now engaging in massive surveillance of its own citizens domestically. You see things like national security letters, which were part of the Patriot Act. And have any of you all heard of these national security letters or NSLs? No. Okay, one person, two people. So these national security letters are basically, it's a provision in the Patriot Act that allows the FBI and the Department of Justice to access individuals' personal records. So things like their financial records, emails, phone calls, things like that. And it's for the purposes, or stated for the purpose of combating terrorism. But the other part of this is that when you get one of these national security letters, it also comes with a gag order. And so you can't tell anyone that you've gotten one. And so you can't tell anyone you've gotten one, and you don't really have any kind of recourse for fighting against it. Because you have this, they're violating your personal, they're violating your personal liberties, but you can't tell anybody about it. Now, the thing like the Freedom Act, for example, didn't really touch this at all. So now you still get the NSL, you still get the gag order, but now you have like a route to kind of appeal. So now, and this is the kicker, if the person complains about having the gag order in the NSL, then a judge has to hear it. That should really like blow everyone's mind. It's like, we're not going to take any kind of measurements to stop the actual violation in the first place, but we'll maybe kind of leave a little wiggle room on the back end in case somebody gets upset. I think yesterday I also talked to you all about this example of the cell site simulators, the Marco Polo telephone thing. That's being used by not only a variety of federal organizations, but as I mentioned yesterday, also being used domestically by a variety of police departments. All of these things, of course, in the name of combating terrorism. So what are some open questions that we could ask? And again, this is one of those talks when I bring it up to people, the answers are not cut and dry. So these are questions that are very genuine and they're open to discussion. So are the appropriate policies being pursued? Is this the best that we can do? Maybe all of the other policies that we might potentially put on the table wouldn't do as good of a job. What are those policies? We can talk about that. How likely is it that policies are doing more harm than good? Again, that's the whole idea of a trade-off. So I talked to you all yesterday again about that emphasis on homegrown terror domestically. Well, is this new homegrown terror preferable to foreign terrorism that we experienced historically? What other options might be preferable? And even if we say that these kinds of things have a benefit, what's the cost? And are we taking into account all of these different costs? And so just to kind of wrap up what we talked about already, I know you all probably all heard of the Freedom Act. There's a lot of debate about whether or not the Freedom Act actually does anything to fix what is wrong with the Patriot Act. Depending on who you read, you'll get different answers. Some people will say yes, some people will say this is actually effectively worse than what we had under the Patriot Act. And then there's something else too, and this I was just reading, it happened a couple of days ago. Did you all hear about the US government databases getting hacked, and hackers took a bunch of information about US government personnel? Well, again, this goes back to the very first slide that I put up there. I put in that thing about having backdoors to encryption. This is a problem. So this is another kind of cost and benefit that we can talk about. And so with that, this is what I imagine by deer incidents, by the way. This is what I have in my brain. So if you can't read it, it says, 2 men attacked by deer. Deer then stole man's cigarettes. All right, I think we're at time. So thank you guys for participating, and I hope this was good.